So I often get asked why I'm not using Redux or if I can do more videos using Redux. And I'm not really using Redux anymore, so this video is to explain why that is and what I've been using instead of Redux. So when I was first learning React, this was one of the projects I made in the very beginning called Menu Monkey, and I used Redux for it, and I liked using Redux, and I still do like Redux. I think it's a nice library, and one of the things that I was using it for, there's really three big things that I would use Redux for. The first is to kind of pass data or state between components. That's kind of like the most obvious one that you use Redux for. It's a state container. And so if I have components that are not close to each other, it doesn't make sense to just use local state. I might want to use something that like Redux where I can easily plug in and get access to the Redux data from any component. That's kind of a nice, having the ability to do that's very nice. The second thing I would use it for is for fetching data from an API and storing that data there. And so I would use that in conjunction with something like Redux Saga or Redux Thunk. And I would fetch the data from the API, and then I would store the data in Redux. And then I could use that in my components, and I could update the data in Redux, and it would update the state and whatnot. And then lastly, I would use Redux for storing forms. So I used to use Redux Form, and I would store my form data in there. So as users were filling out the form, I could do validation and whatnot, and I did that with Redux Form. So I've basically migrated those three things that I used to use Redux for and used three different libraries instead now. So the first one, so I've really transferred using forms to using something called Formic, which I quite like. And if you even go into the getting started of Formic, it'll actually talk about why Formic is a good idea instead of using Redux Form. It makes a lot of sense to move your form data outside of your store and put it inside of like local state, for example, just in the React component. The other thing is I don't really fetch data from APIs anymore. So all my projects pretty much now are using GraphQL. I absolutely love it. And so I'm using Apollo to fetch data and to store the data and to cache the data. And Apollo works really well with that. And so I'm using this and I'm using GraphQL and I'm not really using REST. If I was using REST, maybe I would be using Redux more. But right now I'm using GraphQL and using Apollo for that. And then lastly, I could still use Redux with my GraphQL projects and with Apollo and with Formic if I wanted to. Just to pass data between different components that are far away or that makes sense to do that. But one thing I've been liking or using lately instead of that is something called unstated, or I'm using just the React Context API. And the reason for that is these things are just really simple and really easy to do. And that's the whole purpose of this library right here. So you can see here's an example of a counter. All we have to do is we create a class which stores our state, and then we just treat it almost like a local state. So you can create methods that update the state, and then all we have to do is subscribe to that container or that store that we created, and we can now use that state, and we can subscribe to it anywhere in our application, kind of like how you can connect anywhere in your application with Redux. So I've kind of switched my use cases that I would used to do stuff with Redux, and now I'm using these three libraries instead, and I'm liking it a lot better. Now, if I had an advanced application that was doing a lot of state management just within the application itself, then I think it could make sense to use Redux instead of unstated. But a lot of times I don't have too complex of kind of like I would call a global state or state that I want to share across components that need to have a store that is accessible by any component. I don't need that too often to be super complex, and that this seems to work pretty well right now. So for that reason, I'm not using Redux, and I'm not really including it in a lot of my tutorials because I find it to be unnecessary. And one of the downsides of Redux is there's a lot of boilerplate to it, which I didn't like when I was using it. So I've been using this unstated, and there's a lot less boilerplate, which I really like. But yeah, so not using Redux anymore, and that's pretty much why.